So I'm Steve Brierley, the CEO of Riverlane. I've been working in quantum computing for many years now. A long time ago as an academic, and founded Riverlane because I saw that quantum hardware was really progressing at a rapid rate. That was 5 years ago, and since then I've built Riverlane, been joined by an amazing team of people. We're about 35 people today, and as Roger said, we sit in the middle of the stack. We partner with hardware companies and build the operating system for quantum computers. That sounds like a grand thing, and we can sort of dig into what that really means. For me, it means solving some of the complex issues that get between a user and a useful quantum computer.
No, that's a really good place to start, Steve, because this is billed as a fireside chat. I think it's 27 degrees outside, so I'm going to call it a water cooler chat. Okay,
sounds good. Yeah,
we're I think one reaction from some people might be, so you're sitting in the middle of a quantum computer. Hang on a minute, there isn't one yet. How can you be in the business of promoting applications and software? So maybe. Let's, rather than talk about where we are now, is where do you think we're going to be in the near future in terms of the UK scene on quantum? Because some people who are listening to us will say, yes, we know that there's quantum-like activities going on in computing, or there's simulations of quantum computers or of quantum annealers, and others will be saying, hang on a minute, I thought that was all futuristic stuff and no one's got a quantum computer yet. So where do you think we're going to get to in the next 5 years, which will change people's views on that?
Yeah, so I mean, we're building on 25 years of development. This is not coming from nowhere. For me, in the next 5 years, what you're going to see is the industry getting to the point where quantum hardware together with the software is really challenging what's possible on a non-quantum bit of kit, right? So on your laptop. The analogy I like to think of is of digital cameras. So the early digital cameras were clearly rubbish. And in fact, Kodak, who invented them, decided not to pursue the digital camera. It had 0.01 megapixels. It was really heavy. It was clunky. It wasn't as good as film cameras. And it's very much the same with quantum computing today. And I think the next 5 years is so exciting because that's the point where we start to see a real inflection crossover of the quantum computers meeting some of the performance of traditional classical computers.
Yeah, and there's always two stories running, and we can probably try and tease this out as we chat. There's always a technical story and there's an industry story, and they inform each other. So I agree with you totally with your analogy. And I look around the computing world at the moment, and I'm trying to spot the Kodak of today in terms of the computing side, as some people will totally underestimate the speed at which it's moving. And I know, because I think you and I first met about 2 years ago, just over 2 years ago, when you got your first round of seed funding, and you're now sitting with a company of 35 people and significant activities. So one message, I think, is it is moving fast. How far away do you think we are from someone actually buying something because they can do, because we have the lab demonstrations of quantum advantage, but how far away are we from someone actually spending some money on hardware and software because they can do something with it which they just couldn't do with what they can use with a classical computer? Is it 5 years? Is it 10 years? Or is it 2? Maybe I'm not even following my own advice and not recognizing the speed.
Yes, I think it is at least 5 years. I think it's perhaps over-optimistic to think that this is going to happen instantaneously. I think of this less as a on-off moment, a kind of sharp hockey stick, and more a transition. And I guess that's, let's stick with this digital camera analogy. I mean, the first adopters were the the professionals, the sort of experts in the field, and it took some time before now my phone has a camera that's so good I feel like a professional photographer. So that adoption cycle is itself going to take time. So in the next 5 years, what I would look for is the sort of early aha moments. So something like the AlphaGo moments in machine learning, where you had individual demonstrations that just had very clear implications. So in quantum computing, look for things like the simulation of a chemical system or of a molecule of a collection of atoms that on a classical computer would be exceptionally hard. That the computational chemists who do this every day would clearly say, yes, that's hard. I can't do that. And a demonstration on a quantum computer that performs that calculation much more efficiently.
So, I mean, one of the things which the difference between academic timescales and industry is if you're going to do something big and serious in industry, you're used to having to get acclimatized to a new technology, maybe training some people in it, learning about it, buying a book about it, possibly, if you're a technology company, because that just sitting around and waiting for it to appear is actually probably not a sensible thing to do, because if you're looking at new technologies, you want to get a competitive advantage. So are there actually people coming to you now? Because what I've described is a kind of 3-year window. The now moment is sometime within the next 3 years, you better be ready for it. Do you actually have companies coming to you saying, for all intents and purposes, I want to start planning on using a quantum computer, what can I do now? Is it at that stage, or do you think that's just a little bit over the horizon?
No, that's definitely happening right now, and more than different in multiple ways. The way you've just described is sort of, let's say a pharmaceutical company, they see that the way they perform certain calculations could easily get disrupted here and would like to dig in deeper and understand the technology. You also get technology companies that we partner with, for example, ARM, looking at their technology and what could a company like ARM do? If ARM was starting now, what would it do? That was literally their opening question. And so, yes, very much so, sort of partnering with the sort of experts in the field in order to kind of strategically position themselves in the future. That's certainly happening.
And are there certain sectors you think have got it and others who are being more cautious? Or is it not arranged by sector? It's down, if you like, to the imagination of the companies concerned?
I think that depends on a couple of factors. So it's quite tricky to get deep into where quantum computers will have a big advantage. The first thing you learn is that superposition. That's like the quantum computer can follow many paths. So this sounds amazing, right? I mean, you can follow many paths and solve these very complex problems by just magically at the end collapsing down onto your solution. But it turns out it doesn't quite work like that, because when you collapse at the end, effectively what you've done is pick one of the paths. And you may as well have picked that right from the beginning. So you don't really need a quantum computer to search a random path. So what's tricky is that in quantum computers, they use this notion of constructive and destructive interference. And this is a really key concept. A few people in the world have figured out how to exploit that property of quantum mechanics to get exponential speed-ups in the types of calculations you can perform. So that's just a bit of sort of the technical background, but the implication is that there are some problems where you have an exponential advantage. Your quantum computer goes not like 100 or 100 squared or 100 cubed. It goes like 2 to the 100. I mean, that's just vastly faster than any other classical computer. And so this means that there's a collection of problems where no classical computer will ever solve that problem, even if you turn the whole world into a supercomputer. And you contrast that with, for example, Google's Sycamore chip. It's about the size of a postage stamp. So they picked a great toy problem. This it's a fairly random problem, but it was designed to be good for the quantum computer. And they showed that on that problem, the quantum computer could outperform Summit, the largest supercomputer in the world, like 2 tennis courts of compute, even a couple of years ago, even with 53 qubits. So when looking for applications, it's really important to start with those problems where there's this massive driving force behind quantum computing. And that's kind of the reason why, even though quantum computers are very early, even though we still have a long way to go to build a device, there's actually a chance that they could catch up with $1 trillion of investment in CMOS technology.
Yeah, and I think there's some really interesting ideas there about, if you like, the unknown unknowns, because one view of it, which I think people have got used to realizing isn't the case, is when you talk about these currently intractable problems. People say you're clutching at straws. You're trying to think of something this amazing thing called the digital computer can't do in order to justify your new toy. Or you turn it round, which I think people are just beginning over the past 2 years to realize, which is, you say, this wonderful thing called the digital computer, which we've found so many uses for, is capable of solving just rather special problems. And we need something to do all of the rest. Which is saying, actually, the opportunity space is absolutely enormous. I mean, do you? We've talked a bit about, obviously, why businesses should take an interest. I sense one of my colleagues, Chris Jones, who you know well, said something's happened in the past few months. He said we've gone from talking about if there is a quantum computer to when there isn't a quantum computer. Sometime round about midnight in the past 6 months, a kind of cloud of certainty descended on everybody, and they realized it was inevitable. Do you really feel for what we've been doing right as a community to get that confidence?
That's a great question. I think it's that largely as a community, the vast majority has focused on what are the key challenges to getting from where we are to this kind of great future, the sort of North Star, right? And the North Star has always been the same, that we built this, it's called a fault-tolerant quantum computer. It just means we built a system, it's large, it's got likely millions or billions of physical components, and it implements various techniques around error correction and so on. So this North Star of building a large-scale system, because we know there's value there, and really the community has been figuring out, well, what are the technical steps to get there? What do we need to show, and how do we start bringing people along and bringing people in to the community? So bringing in, for example, system-on-chip expertise that we have here at Riverlane, people who worked at places like CERN on super fast readout, like these kind of skills of then being applied to quantum computing, talking to the application space. So not just thinking about applications theoretically or abstractly, but really going and working closely with, let's say, a computational chemist, right? I mean, somebody who's already doing this every day. I think those two things have been very fruitful. And yeah, I totally agree. I think the dial started to shift with John Martinez and his group at Google's demonstration. And there's a really subtle point here. It was that when they went from 5 qubits to 50 qubits, no new physics emerged. They could just scale it up, that the systems engineering was good enough, like it worked. I think that was not obvious at all. And I think that was, a few people spotted, that's a tipping point of, we no longer question whether it's even possible. We now know it's possible. The question is when and how quickly and what we need to get there.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen some different behaviours across communities. I must say, I tell you one which I know well, which I'm slightly nervous of, and we know that quantum computing and quantum technologies are dual use. But if you take the defence sector, I mean, my version of the story of defence since 1945 is anyone in procurement is bombarded by people with half-baked ideas, and to succeed in any career in military procurement, defence procurement, you have to learn how to send as many people away as possible just to find a few good ones. And I feel that a bit with quantum, which is technology readiness levels, signs of immaturity. You know, there's a tremendous feeling that it's not ready yet to procure, and yet the problem is if you don't engage, you're not necessarily going to get what you want, because quantum could have evolved on many pathways. So to some extent, you've got to take an interest in order to get what you want. If you were kind of sitting with I don't know, a CEO of a BP or a BT or someone, or an AstraZeneca, and they said to you, so what's my toolkit? You know, if you kind of opened your briefcase and said, well, to get started, you need one of these, one of these, and one of these. How would you advise someone who potentially could be investing a lot to get over this idea that the danger is they're going to waste their time, or it's just not ready yet, and so on?
Yeah, so it's about fear of missing out or opportunities, same side of the coin, right? So if you are in an area where this technology could really disrupt and totally change your trajectory as a company, that's something you need to know about right now. And so some of the tools are as simple as, well, let's take a top 10 list of problems that are business critical for various reasons. How do that we've honed in? So I think you need to take a bit of a step here of like understanding, well, these are broadly speaking going to be applicable. What would it take to solve that same problem that we have today, that we're running on a HPC platform on a quantum computer? Like, that's a break-even point. I think that's a really useful way of thinking, because it tells you, like, what would it look like right now if I had a quantum computer, and where could what would the technology have to demonstrate to just replace like for like? I think that's a first step, because there's always this second step, which is, well, if I could do that and I could do a whole bunch of other things, then what? So in the simulation of quantum systems, I like this example. The longest ever simulation of a protein interacting with an organic molecule, which you would be interested in for drug discovery, for example, is around a single nanosecond. Just seen on a computer. This was done by a special purpose piece of hardware called Anton, built by D.E. Shaw Research. Big group, loads of smart people, really pushing the boundaries of what's possible to simulate, entirely ignoring two things. So one is that the timescale is way too short. So proteins move over the timescale of a second. So we've seen like the opening credits of a film, and we want to watch the rest. Like, there are lots of different opportunities to bind a drug to a protein as it moves. And the second is that we know in various systems, quantum effects are hugely important. And these simulations entirely ignore quantum mechanics. So we've thrown out all of the physics. So there's a great question, like, well, what would be possible if you could perfectly simulate a protein on the length scale of a second, entirely capturing all of the quantum mechanics? It's a tangible question you could put to a fairly forward-thinking researcher, for example. And I think exploring in that space is really valuable. And then I guess the last thing to do, is the third point, it would be, you can just play around with these systems right now. So here in the UK, we have every technology. So there are the four major ways of building a quantum computer involve superconducting systems, these great chandeliers that you see IBM and Google talking about, ion trap systems, so that's individual atoms, photonic systems, so using photons as the basic element, and silicon, so individual electrons typically being trapped in silicon. So these are 4 different ways to build a quantum computer. I think one of the things that's so exciting is that they all appear to be working. There seems to be no fundamental blockage. They're on different hardware technology trajectories, of course, but they're all progressing well. And so one of the things you can do here in the UK is test them all. You could see, well, with my early stage digital camera equivalent on a quantum computer, what could I do? Of course, it's going to be blurry, it's going to be simple, but you can actually go and experiment with the technology and build some of the expertise in the team.
So you raise an interesting point, which is you've chosen to start your company in the UK. I think that's probably the fairest thing to say for many reasons, I guess. But are you worried at all that the UK won't be able to deliver on the progress you need to see on hardware platforms to keep your story going? So how do you feel? I think we've moved away from the idea it's a bit like a moonshot where everyone's got a hangar where they're trying to assemble a computer and one day the doors will open and we see whose is biggest. I think we've moved a bit away from that. But what's your confidence level in the hardware scene in the UK and our ability to actually keep up with you and your ideas about applications?
Yeah, so we have this amazing foundation. I would say it's a really critical time for the UK. Some of the best technology and people are currently here in the UK. I mean, as a company, we very much chose to work here in the UK. It was a very conscious decision. Clearly, it's easier to raise money in Silicon Valley, let's say, but we wouldn't have that access to the ecosystem in the UK. Within a 50-mile drive, we can visit 8 different quantum computing companies, and that's really unique across right across these different technologies, and that's enabled us to develop this operating system layer in a way that's portable across the different platforms, and then that becomes super attractive to the end users because they don't need to be tied into one particular approach, and so it really, by partnering closely with lots of different hardware technologies, it sort of forced us to think about our product in a different way. I mean, I think you're right, though, that Riverlane is a global company, and indeed we now partner with 3 US hardware manufacturers. I think the UK has been kind of early in realizing that partnerships were going to be key in this ecosystem. So partnering in order to focus on what you're really good at as a company, that we started to see that replicate in the US as well now.
Yeah, so I mean, since we first met, I mean, where you knew a lot about quantum computing. Now, Riverlane wouldn't have grown as much if you hadn't learnt a lot about money in the meantime.
Yeah.
Do you think there is, because to some extent you're saying we've got the difficult bit. We've got this incredible intellectual property. We've got these world-class universities. We've got some smart people. Do you see anything intrinsic in the UK, the culture, the way we're structured, which means that we shouldn't be able to find UK investment?
Yeah, fundamentally, no. And indeed, we raised from UK venture capital funds, Amadeus, backed by Herman Hauser, Cambridge Innovation Capital, and most recently Draper Esprit, all UK deep tech investors who've done this journey many times. I mean, Herman sits on our board, and I think we got to a critical point where the product development was going really well, the tech was going really well, we're a really nice sized team, and the question came how fast to expand. And Herman shared this really important lesson, which was, Acorn had an amazing operating system, but Microsoft beat them to it. And that's because Microsoft was a global company. And so for any UK company to succeed, it needs to operate on a global scale. There's no reason why we can't do that in the UK. So I think kind of coming back to the premise of the discussion, like for me, the opportunity for the UK is not just to get ready for this technology in a passive way, but to really get stuck in. Because if we do that well, we have the chance to build a global company, the next Microsoft, the next Intel, whether that comes from hardware or software, I don't think we know at this point. Perhaps we even get both.
There's a question come in, so let me morph slightly into some of the questions, because when we're talking about the location, and obviously the great thing about you being in the UK is jobs, people, and building a company, which got many societal benefits, quite apart from what you deliver. But there is this business with quantum computing and cloud access, which kind of says geography doesn't matter. So wherever you're based, if you're a provider of services or software or equipment, you should be able to access a market anywhere. But it also means, of course, that there's global competition for any company, because they could choose to have a quantum computer, or they could choose to buy it as a service. That's quite a sweeping statement, because it may not be as simple as that. What's your view of the importance of access to a real machine?
I think so quantum computers are expensive right now, and that's going to continue to be the case for many years, and certainly in the next 5 years. And so that likely implies that you will want to share time on these devices. And if you start from there, then you reach a conclusion that, well, most people are going to access quantum through the cloud or through some remote access. I don't think that means necessarily that all access will be through completely shared and globally shared resources. For example, many companies today use private cloud services, so facilitated by one of the big providers, but only available to them. Many cloud services use regional hardware data centers. So I think it's a bit more nuanced. I think for us, working in the lab is very valuable, and as a company, we certainly have engineers working side by side with the physicists. So for us, we will. But that just means we have people in everybody's labs, right? I mean, that's fine from our perspective. But for the more general user, I would really anticipate that remote access is the way that this is used.
Yeah, and I think, a good answer as we sit here, so hopefully coming out of lockdown, is everyone's going to have a bit of a reevaluation of what you want to do face to face versus what you do down a wire. That applies to quantum computing meetings and everything else. Another question which had come in, and we can kind of broaden the conversation around this. But I at the front made it quite clear that my role is a quantum one, working for the government. You founded a quantum company. And we've got one question which says, doesn't quite say, but I could paraphrase as, well, of course you guys are going to talk it up. It's like nuclear fusion or flying cars. So there's a real question, which is, at the moment, someone would say, well, Steve Brierley would say that, wouldn't he? But I think some of us have seen what John Martinez do and saw some of the stories come out of academia. But how far away do you think either you or others in this game are in absolutely quashing the idea that part of the fun of this is, in fact, that it looks incredibly close, but in fact is much more difficult than it seems?
So I don't think the time horizon has changed in the past 10 years. So we've just got 10 years closer, right? And so we made a prediction in 5 years ago that in around 10 years' time, in around 5 years' time, we would get to this computational supremacy type moment. That happened 4 years ahead, so we were 1 year out. And we made that prediction on the back of 20 years of demonstrations in the lab. the reason I founded Riverlane was exactly this question. So I was at a conference in Italy. I was giving a talk about some algorithm development that I had done. And at the conference, there was this straw poll, basically, of the great and the good from quantum computing, asking who thought we would have a quantum computer in 5, 10, 50 years. And about a third of the audience, so this was 5 years ago, thought that we would never have a quantum computer. About a third of the audience thought, well, 20 to 50 years, but probably not even in our lifetime. And this really struck me that maybe I was developing algorithms for a computer that would never exist. The physics was just too hard. And what we've seen in terms of hardware development and algorithm and software development over the last 5 years has really continued to close that gap. And I think if you just look at the trends, it's increasingly convincing.
Yeah.
And it doesn't take away from that there's loads to do. I wouldn't say, today, there is, quantum computers are not as good as your laptop. That's true. But they're coming pretty quick. And if you look at the subset of problems where quantum has an exponential advantage, that pretty quick starts to look all of a sudden like very meaningful.
Well,
and as long as you understand, well, it's not everything that's sped up. It's this subset that's sped up. I think then there's no hype there. That's just reality.
Yes, and it was interesting. Someone said to me, I think round about the time John Martinez's team did their demonstration, well, how soon before I get it on my phone? And one answer was, well, when you next do a Google search, mate. It's there's more to having the capability than actually having to host the hardware. But there's an interesting question coming, which I do like. I think it was once ARM had become established with their amazing family of RISC processors, that someone worked out how early in the morning you probably encountered your first ARM processor. But it wasn't controlling your toothbrush, it was your toaster or your phone. And there's this question about maybe smaller scale repetitive computing. I mean, I don't know whether we haven't talked about machine learning, for example, and we've tended to talk rather mainframey rather than real-time embedded processing, which is what an awful lot of us really experience in computing now, rather than something covered in lights, blinking lights in the basement. What's your view on, if you like, how rapidly people suddenly find they're only getting through their day because of quantum computing?
And that's a good question. So the way I think about this is there are some problems where we know exactly what's going to happen, right? So we know, in 10 years' time, you'll be using a phone whose material was invented because somebody previously invented a quantum computer, and then they did some simulation that found a property so it's a tool, right? It's computers as a tool. I think where you're driving at is sort of, what about using computers quantum computers every day, like in their function? And there, I think we know a lot less. There are lots of people searching in this space. There are lots of people exploring areas like using quantum computing or machine learning. There are lots of really promising ideas. And I fully expect to see those being fleshed out as you get more chance to actually test these ideas on the hardware. Because many of the things that work on classical computers work a bit outside of their theoretical bounds. So we often use programs where there's some intuition that it should work, but we can't really prove that, that's the right approach. It's just that it works in practice. So that kind of heuristic space is very hard to reason about ahead of time.
It was good to see you actually having to kind of tap dance a bit, Steve, because I think as we draw this to an end, I think the actual answer when someone asks this question about how real is it is, well, look at the companies and look at people like yourself and what you're actually doing, because I must admit my early concerns at hype have gone because by and large, you mentioned it yourself, people can sit and say, well, actually, we're doing exactly what we said we did. do. You know, we're pretty much on course, and thank you for. I think for the people listening to you speak will know that you're steering a steady course, and the success of Riverlane, which is considerable to date, is well deserved, and we look forward to, I'm sure, to hearing of future successes as well. So thanks very much indeed.
Great, thanks, Roger.
Okay. So I think I might still be on, in which case, thank you very much to Steve indeed for an honest approach. They're obviously one of many companies in the UK which are doing so well. And to give you an idea, I think currently we're funding about 80 from Innovate UK, from UKRI. So it's probably a bigger sector than you realise. And that's it. I think we're almost out of time. So thank you very much.